Hello, I'm Mark, and this is In the Round, On-Armature Bust Tutorial Series, Part 6, the neck, shoulders, and chest. Having established the basic dimensions and locations of the facial features, we will now build up the neck, shoulders, and chest. In profile, the primary structures of the neck can be conveniently schematized into a tilted quadrangle divided into two triangles. The back or posterior triangle corresponds to the trapezius muscle, the front or anterior triangle to the structures of the neck from the hyoid bone down to the suprasternal notch, including the trachea, the thyroid cartilage, and a bunch of other stuff that's not really that important for you to know. The dividing line between these triangles is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Note that the top side of this quadrangle will be longer than the bottom. That is, and this is somewhat unintuitive, the top of the neck where it meets the head is thicker than the base of the neck where it inserts into the shoulder girdle. The angle of the top side of the quadrangle is about 15 to 20 degrees from horizontal. The angle of the bottom will vary widely based on the development of the trapezius muscles, but there will always be at least some angle in the shoulders. Making the shoulders too flat is a very common error. Also note the angle of the neck backward into the shoulders. Making the neck too upright and columnar is also quite a common mistake. We'll start by positioning the sternocleidomastoid, which originates at the sternum and the clavicle and inserts at the mastoid process of the temporal bone. The mastoid process is that lump you can feel right behind your ear. This muscle is very prominent when the head is turned. Make 2 coils of clay, each about 3/4 to 1 1/4 inch in diameter, and lay them along the sides of the neck, angling up and back from the suprasternal notch to the mastoid process. Work them in, noting that the sternal head of the sternocleidomastoid will be sharper and more prominent than the clavicular head. Next, we'll start to build up the trapezius, a kite-shaped muscle of the upper back that runs all the way from the external occipital protuberance down to the bottom of the thorax and out to the acromion, where the scapula meets the clavicle to form the shoulder girdle. Take 2 large teardrop-like masses of clay and lay them along the back sides of the neck with their points up towards the occipital. Work them downward, outward, and forward to create the volumes of the trapezius. Build these up with more clay as necessary. You'll likely also need to build up the back and to thicken the column of the base of the bust quite significantly at this point. Now we'll add a simple throat structure. We can develop this more specifically later, but for now just make a cone of clay and flatten it on one side. Position it point downwards beneath the chin. If the angle of the neck already looks pretty good in profile, this might be a very small addition. If the neck looks too upright, it could be fairly large. Note when forming the throat that we have yet to fully develop the chin and the jaw. We will now move down to the chest, back, and shoulders. If you haven't already decided how much of the torso you're going to include in your bust, now is the time. Be aware that it's always good to sculpt beyond the point you intend to stop. Everything in the body is connected, and it's almost impossible to sculpt to avoid with any accuracy. So if you want to end at, say, just above the nipple line, you'll want to sculpt down to below the pectoralis, and then cut back. First, build out the clavicle. Take 2 1/2 to 3/4 inch diameter coils, and, starting on either side of the suprasternal notch, lay them across the shoulder back towards the acromion. To locate the acromion, raise your arm. The bony plate that you feel in the bay between the anterior and posterior lobes of the deltoid is the acromion. There will be a gentle S-curve to each side of the clavicle. Taken together, they look something like a recurved bow, the ends of which point slightly forward when viewed from above. This will mean that, in a relaxed position, most shoulders will curve slightly forward, making the back broader than the chest. Work the clavicles in. Having established the clavicles, we will now begin to build up the deltoids. The deltoid cups the shoulder girdle on either side. originating at the spine of the scapula and back, at the acromion on the side, and at the lateral third of the clavicle in front. It inserts into the deltoid tuberosity at about the midpoint of the humerus. In general, the deltoid steps down slightly from the acromion. Its volume isn't smooth, but gently faceted. Of particular note is the intersection of the shoulders and the torso. Beginners often make the error of positioning the shoulders too far out from the thorax. In actuality, the thorax tapers at the top, and the shoulders rest in large part above the chest. Note how the clavicular attachment of the deltoid starts more or less above the nipple. Having established the deltoids, begin to build up the chest by defining the angle of the sternum in profile. Note that the first third or so of the sternum, called the manubrium, will have a slightly steeper angle than the lower 2/3, about 15 to 18 degrees from vertical. Check the protraction or retraction of the head over the thorax in profile. Build up the pectoralis major muscles on either side of the sternum. These are fan-shaped muscles originating from the medial 3/5 of the clavicle, the sternum, and the ribs, and converging toward their insertion on the humerus. There will be a slight hollow at the clavicle between the deltoid and the pectoralis major, and a subtle separation between the clavicular portion and the rest of the pectoralis, amplified by a slight twist in the sections as they pass under the deltoid. If you're making breasts, sculpt the pectoralis muscles first, then attach the breast tissue as separate lobes shaped somewhat like bra inserts. Depending on how much space you have to work with at the base, you may not have room to do this effectively, in which case, make your best approximation, noting that the volume of the breast tissue starts a little below the level of the armpit. Check the volume of the back in profile. The cervical vertebra should angle back from the occipital with a slight outward curve toward the prominence of the 7th cervical vertebra, which will be visible in the diamond-shaped hollow between the 4 extensions of the trapezius. Make sure that there is sufficient fullness in the counter curve of the thoracic vertebra. Beginners often make the thorax too thin and flat through from sternum to spinal column. The complexity of the upper back, coupled with its mobility, can make it a bit ambiguous when it comes to the specifics. It's a good idea, therefore, to have a generalized understanding of the upper back's primary masses. I've here drawn these masses out schematically. The superior and lateral extensions of the trapezius curve down and out around its central depression to the broad crest of the spine of the scapula. Note the slight bump of the 7th cervical vertebra. The central valley through which runs the spinal column is formed between the volumes of the rhomboids and the lower extension of the trapezius. These volumes rest in turn between the slightly greater elevation of the scapula. There is a subtle transition where the posterior lobe of the deltoid attaches to the spine of the scapula. Having developed the back, work your structures together and refine them to your satisfaction, making any necessary adjustments. Check your symmetry along the midline. Check the volume of each structure. Are they full enough? Too full? Check your definition. You want your structures to be distinctly but subtly defined. That is, the transitions between them should be clean and sharp, but not too dramatic. We'll talk a lot more about definition and how to balance structural clarity with refinement at the later stages of the sculpt. But at this point, it's best to keep your structures over-defined so that you don't lose track of what's what and where it goes. Make any necessary corrections. The masses of the neck, shoulders, and chest are now sufficiently developed to proceed. Final detailing and articulation of form will occur after we take the bust off the armature, hollow it out, and reassemble it. Next, in part 7, we'll take a closer look at how to make a nose.